A woman stepped down from a gleaming black SUV and dropped a thick folder onto the hood of Ethan Carter's truck without so much as a greeting. Her heels sank slightly into the gravel, but she did not seem to notice or care. She wore a blazer the color of dried blood and sunglasses that hid whatever was left of her patience. Behind her, two men in matching polo shirts stood holding clipboards like soldiers waiting for orders. The morning was cold, the kind of cold that came just before the mountain forests turned orange and gold, and Ethan could smell wood smoke drifting from somewhere down the ridge. "You have 30 days to hand over these 1,600 acres, the woman said, tapping the folder twice with a manicured finger. Ethan looked at the folder, then at her, then back at the folder again, and for a long moment he said nothing at all. He had lived alone on this land long enough to know that silence was often more useful than argument. Finally, he asked the only question that mattered to him. "So how exactly do you all plan on driving into your neighborhood?" The woman laughed, a short, sharp sound that seemed to bounce off the pines behind her. She pushed her sunglasses up onto her head just long enough to let him see the certainty in her eyes. "That," she said, "is no longer your problem." 6 months later, that same woman would stand in front of a locked steel gate, staring at hundreds of her own neighbors trapped on the far side of it, unable to get home. Because after they won a partial piece of the lawsuit they had fought so hard to bring, they discovered something that should have been obvious from the very beginning. The only road leading into their exclusive community had never belonged to the homeowners association at all. It had always belonged to him. Word of the confrontation spread through Ridgeview Summit before the sun had even finished climbing over the ridge, carried mostly by the two men in polo shirts who had stood behind Victoria Sterling that morning, and could not resist repeating the exchange to anyone who would listen. By the time residents gathered at the community mailboxes later that afternoon, the story had already taken on the shape Victoria preferred, one in which she had simply delivered an overdue legal notice to a stubborn landowner unwilling to cooperate. Few of them stopped to consider the question Ethan had asked her directly, the one about how exactly anyone intended to reach their homes if the road in question truly belonged to someone else. It was a question that would matter far more than any of them understood on that particular morning, though its full weight would not become clear for many months. Ethan Carter was 52 years old, and he had spent nearly all of those years on the same stretch of mountain land his great-great-grandfather had cleared with an axe and a mule more than a century earlier. The property stretched across 1,600 acres of pine forest, meadow, and rocky ridgeline, deeded down through 5 generations without a single gap in the paperwork. He lived alone in a modest cedar house near the tree line, heated mostly by wood, and he asked very little of the world beyond quiet mornings and honest work. Neighbors in town knew him as polite but reserved, a man who fixed his own fences and rarely spoke unless spoken to first. When the Ridgeview Summit development broke ground a decade earlier, carving a gated community into a pocket of land nestled deep inside his property boundary, Ethan had not objected. The developers needed access, and the only practical route in and out ran directly across a gravel road his family had maintained for generations. Rather than make an issue of it, he simply let the new homeowners use the road, refusing every offer of payment and asking nothing in return. For years, delivery trucks, moving vans, and family sedans rolled past his porch without a second thought, and he never once raised the subject of ownership. That arrangement held quietly until the autumn morning Victoria Sterling arrived in her SUV with a survey crew and a stack of freshly drawn property lines. As the newly elected president of the Homeowners Association, Victoria had built her reputation on control, precision, and an unshakable belief that enough money and the right attorney could resolve any inconvenience. She informed Ethan, without preamble, that a new survey commissioned by the association showed the access road technically fell within community land, and that portions of his acreage encroached on Ridgeview Summit's boundary lines. She demanded he surrender the disputed sections immediately, framing it less as a request and more as a formality he was expected to accept. Ethan read through the survey papers twice, noted the inconsistencies in the boundary markers, and calmly declined. He explained, evenly, and without raising his voice, that the road had always run through land his family had held since long before Ridgeview Summit existed. Victoria's expression tightened, but she said nothing further that day, simply gathering her papers and returning to her SUV. As she drove away, Ethan stood on his porch and watched the dust settle behind her tires, sensing that this was only the opening move in something far larger than a fence dispute. Within 2 weeks, the letters began arriving in a steady, deliberate rhythm designed to wear him down. The Homeowners Association's attorney sent formal notices citing supposed encroachment violations, followed by warnings about unauthorized structures, followed by manufactured administrative fines for infractions that had never existed on his land before. One letter demanded he remove a section of fencing that had stood in the same place for 60 years, claiming it now violated a community setback rule that somehow applied to property the association did not even own. Another threatened legal action if he continued to, in the letter's words, obstruct reasonable access negotiations. Victoria herself began appearing at the edge of his property with increasing frequency, sometimes alone, sometimes with board members trailing behind her like an entourage. She spoke to him the way a person speaks to someone they have already decided does not matter, dismissing his quiet manner as weakness rather than restraint. She assumed, correctly in some ways and incorrectly in others, that a man living alone on a mountain with no corporate backing could never afford to fight a homeowners association with a legal fund in the hundreds of thousands. Her strategy, as she confided to a fellow board member over coffee one afternoon, was simple: pressure him long enough, and eventually he would sell rather than endure the hassle. What Victoria did not account for was Ethan's patience, nor the fact that patience and passivity were not the same thing. Rather than respond to each provocation publicly, he began making quiet phone calls to a land use attorney 2 counties over, a woman named Renee Alvarez, who specialized in historic property disputes. He hired an independent survey team to walk his boundary lines from scratch, ignoring the association's newly drawn maps entirely. He also began digging through county archives, requesting deeds, easement records, and inheritance filings that stretched back over 100 years, searching for the paper trail his grandfather had always claimed existed, but had never needed to prove. Renee Alvarez had built her career representing families who found themselves on the losing end of exactly this kind of pressure, developers and associations with deep pockets betting that ordinary landowners would fold before ever setting foot in a courtroom. She recognized the pattern in the association's letters immediately, noting how each new demand escalated slightly beyond the last, designed to create the impression of an unstoppable legal machine grinding toward an inevitable outcome. Rather than respond to each letter individually, she advised Ethan to acknowledge receipt only, offering no substantive engagement that might reveal how much he already knew or suspected about the true history of the road. Their strategy, from the very beginning, depended on letting Victoria and her attorneys believe they held every advantage until the moment it mattered most to prove otherwise. Those who watched closely noticed that Ethan's calm was not confusion but preparation, though few in Ridgeview Summit paid enough attention to see it. He kept his findings to himself, filing documents quietly rather than announcing them, and continued his daily routine of splitting wood and checking fence lines as though nothing unusual were happening at all. Anyone driving past his cedar house would have seen only an unremarkable man going about an unremarkable life. Beneath that surface, however, a case was slowly taking shape, built one archival record at a time. By late autumn, Victoria Sterling had grown tired of letters and lawyers' warnings that produced no results, and she pushed the Homeowners Association's board to file a full lawsuit against Ethan Carter. The claim demanded a formal transfer of the disputed acreage into the community's ownership, monetary damages for what the filing called years of obstructed development potential, and a court order stripping Ethan of any continued right to control access across the property. Victoria presented the lawsuit to residents as a necessary and overdue correction, framing it as the community finally standing up for what was rightfully theirs. Most residents, trusting the confident woman who ran their monthly meetings with practiced authority, accepted her version of events without question. Local news outlets picked up the story within days, running segments about a wealthy mountain community suing a lone landowner over road access, and the coverage tilted heavily in the association's favor. Reporters interviewed Victoria at length, allowing her to describe Ethan as an obstacle to reasonable community growth, while Ethan himself declined every interview request that came his way. Several residents, eager to participate in what felt like a righteous cause, began sharing photographs of his property online, captioning them with comments about selfish landowners standing in the way of progress. A few even drove past his fence line specifically to record video for their social feeds, treating the dispute as entertainment rather than a serious legal matter affecting a man's inherited home. Not every resident joined the chorus against him, however, and a small handful of longtime homeowners quietly began asking questions that Victoria found increasingly difficult to answer. An older couple who had lived in Ridgeview Summit since its earliest days recalled, during one community gathering, that the original developers had specifically mentioned relying on the neighboring landowners' goodwill when the project first broke ground. Their recollection contradicted the narrative Victoria had been building for weeks, and though she dismissed the comment quickly at the time, it lodged itself in the memory of several neighbors who had been present to hear it. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, a quiet undercurrent of doubt began forming beneath the community's outward show of unity, though it would take the trial itself to bring that doubt fully into the open. Ethan absorbed the public criticism the same way he absorbed everything else, without visible reaction, continuing his mornings exactly as he always had. His attorney, Renee Alvarez, advised him against responding to the media narrative at all, explaining that public sentiment would matter far less than documented fact once the case reached a courtroom. She spent those weeks quietly compiling evidence rather than issuing statements, working through county records with a methodical patience that mirrored Ethan's own temperament. Neither of them showed their strongest cards publicly, choosing instead to let Victoria and her legal team continue building a case on assumptions rather than verified history. Behind the scenes, Renee had already uncovered several inconsistencies in the survey the Homeowners Association was relying on, including boundary markers that did not match any historical filing in the county's possession. She suspected, based on early archival digging, that the entire foundation of the association's claim rested on a modern survey that had simply assumed rather than confirmed who held title to the access road. Rather than reveal this early and risk the association adjusting its strategy, she recommended holding the strongest evidence until the moment it would carry the most weight in front of a judge. Ethan agreed without hesitation, trusting her judgment completely, and the two of them continued preparing in near silence, while public opinion in Ridgeview Summit swung further against him. The first day of trial arrived under a gray autumn sky, and the county courthouse parking lot filled early with residents eager to watch what many assumed would be a swift victory for their community. Victoria Sterling walked in wearing a tailored suit, flanked by her attorney and two board members who nodded supportively at every word she said. The Homeowners Association's legal team opened by presenting their newly commissioned survey, along with GPS mapping data and a series of photographs meant to establish that the access road fell squarely within community boundaries. They called a professional surveyor to the stand, a confident man who spoke in dense technical language about coordinate systems and modern mapping precision, and Victoria watched from her seat with the satisfied expression of someone who believed the outcome was already decided. Renee Alvarez, by contrast, asked only a handful of questions during the morning session, declining to challenge most of the association's evidence directly. Ethan sat quietly beside her, offering brief and measured answers whenever the judge or opposing counsel addressed him, never raising his voice or defending himself with the passion the courtroom seemed to expect. Several residents in the gallery exchanged glances, clearly interpreting his restraint as resignation rather than strategy, and a murmur of quiet confidence spread among the association's supporters. Even the judge, a measured woman named Judge Patricia Kwan, occasionally glanced toward the defense table as though wondering whether they intended to mount any real challenge at all. The association's surveyor spent the better part of an hour describing modern satellite mapping techniques, projecting enlarged images onto a screen positioned beside the witness stand for the entire courtroom to study. He spoke confidently about coordinate precision down to fractions of a foot, framing his methodology as far more reliable than any handwritten document from a century earlier could ever hope to be. Victoria's attorney built much of the morning's argument around this contrast, suggesting to the court that outdated paperwork could not possibly compete with modern technology in determining accurate property lines. Ethan listened without reaction, understanding that precision in measurement meant little if the underlying assumption about which parcel one was measuring had been wrong from the very start. As the afternoon session began, the association's attorney grew increasingly aggressive, pressing Ethan with pointed questions about why he had never formally registered a dispute over the road boundary in the years since Ridgeview Summit's construction. He paused deliberately after each answer, letting the silence suggest weakness where none actually existed, and several onlookers began whispering that the old landowner seemed to be losing his composure. It was only as the session neared its close that Renee Alvarez finally rose, walked calmly to the evidence table, and placed a single-aged document in front of the court reporter for formal entry. The document was a hand-drawn survey map dated 1918, its edges yellowed and its ink faded, but its boundary lines still perfectly legible. Judge Kwan examined the map briefly before announcing that the court would require formal verification of its authenticity and historical standing before proceeding further, effectively pausing the trial until the next session. Victoria's confident expression flickered for just a moment, though she recovered quickly, telling reporters outside the courthouse that the delay meant nothing and that her case remained as strong as ever. Ethan said nothing to the cameras, walking past them with the same quiet composure he had carried since the very first letter arrived at his door. Inside the courthouse, however, the introduction of that single document had shifted something fundamental, though almost no one outside the defense table understood it yet. Over the following weeks, county archivists and independent historians worked alongside Renee Alvarez to authenticate the 1918 survey, cross-referencing it against inheritance filings, tax records, and original deed transfers held in the county clerk's basement archive. What emerged was a documented history, far more complete than anyone on the association side had anticipated. tracing unbroken ownership of the disputed acreage through 5 generations of the Carter family. The original survey clearly showed the access road running entirely within what was then, and remained now, private family land, predating the existence of Ridgeview Summit by nearly a full century. Later filings confirmed that any use of the road by outside parties had always existed under informal permission rather than legal easement, meaning the homeowners association had never actually held any enforceable claim to it at all. Renee also uncovered internal association meeting minutes, obtained through a records request, revealing that an earlier board had specifically discussed formalizing an easement agreement with the Carter family years before Victoria's presidency began. That earlier board had ultimately decided against pursuing it, reasoning that Ethan's willingness to allow free access made a formal agreement unnecessary and potentially costly to negotiate. The minutes made clear that the association had always understood its access depended entirely on the landowner's goodwill rather than any legal entitlement, a fact Victoria had either overlooked or deliberately ignored when she pushed the board toward litigation. When Renee presented this discovery to Ethan, he simply nodded, unsurprised, having long suspected that generosity extended freely might one day be mistaken for an obligation owed. Beyond the meeting minutes, Renee's team also located a handwritten letter from Ethan's grandfather, tucked inside an old ledger stored at the County Historical Society, describing the exact boundaries of the family land in his own words, decades before any development existed nearby. The letter mentioned the road specifically, noting that the family had always permitted travelers and later residents to pass through as a matter of neighborly courtesy rather than legal right. Reading his grandfather's careful handwriting for the first time in years, Ethan felt something shift quietly inside him, a reminder that the values guiding his own conduct throughout the dispute had been inherited along with the land itself. He asked Renee to include the letter in the formal court record, not because it was strictly necessary for the legal argument, but because it captured, in his grandfather's own words, exactly what had been forgotten by the people now trying to take that same land away. As word of the historical survey's authentication spread through Ridgeview Summit, a noticeable shift began among the residents who had once cheered Victoria's aggressive strategy. Quiet conversations started happening at community mailboxes and in driveways, residents comparing notes about how confidently Victoria had promised a quick and decisive victory. A few longtime homeowners recalled the earlier board's discussions about the road, wondering aloud why Victoria had never mentioned that history during her impassioned speeches at community meetings. Victoria herself grew visibly tense during this period, snapping at board members during closed-door sessions and refusing to answer direct questions about the earlier easement discussions when residents raised them. Sensing the shifting ground beneath her, Victoria abruptly changed her approach, directing her attorneys to propose a long-term easement agreement rather than continue fighting for outright ownership of the disputed land. She authorized an offer that would grant the association permanent legal access to the road in exchange for dropping all remaining claims against Ethan's broader acreage, hoping to salvage something from a case that had begun slipping away from her. When her attorney presented the proposal to Renee Alvarez, Ethan listened carefully but ultimately declined the offer without much deliberation. He explained, in the same even tone he had used throughout the entire ordeal, that he had once offered the very same access freely and without conditions, and that the association had chosen litigation instead of gratitude. Word of the rejected settlement offer spread quickly among Ridgeview Summit residents, further fracturing the community's once unified support for their board president. Several homeowners began openly questioning Victoria's leadership, pointing out that her refusal to consider a modest compromise years earlier had led directly to a costly legal battle the association appeared destined to lose. A small group of residents formed an informal committee to review the association's legal spending, discovering that Victoria had personally approved hundreds of thousands of dollars in fees without full board consent. The committee's findings, presented in a printed summary distributed to every mailbox in the community, detailed a pattern of decisions made without proper board votes, invoices approved on the same day they arrived, and repeated refusals to consider mediation even when opposing counsel had signaled openness to it. Several residents recalled attending meetings where Victoria had described settlement discussions as premature or unnecessary, assurances they had accepted without realizing how thin the justification behind them truly was. One homeowner, a retired accountant named Walter Higgins, spent an entire weekend cross-referencing invoice dates against board meeting minutes, concluding that nearly 40% of the legal spending had never been formally authorized at all. When Walter presented his findings at the next emergency meeting, the room fell into an uncomfortable silence broken only by Victoria's increasingly strained attempts to explain decisions that no longer sounded reasonable, even to her own ears. The discovery ignited outrage among homeowners who had trusted her judgment completely, many of whom now felt they had been misled from the very beginning of the dispute. The final day of trial arrived with none of the confident energy that had marked the case's opening weeks, and the courtroom gallery held far fewer of Victoria's once enthusiastic supporters. Judge Kwan reviewed both the newly authenticated 1918 survey and the extensive documentary record Renee Alvarez had compiled, comparing it point by point against the modern survey the association had relied upon from the start. In her ruling, she stated plainly that the Homeowners Association held no legitimate ownership claim to either the access road or any portion of the disputed acreage, and that the modern survey submitted at the outset of the case had failed to account for clearly established historical boundaries. She dismissed every claim the association had brought against Ethan Carter, ruling instead that his family's title to the full 1,600 acres remained entirely intact and undisputed. Beyond dismissing the association's claims outright, Judge Kwan ordered the Homeowners Association to cover Ethan's legal fees in full, citing the frivolous and aggressive nature of a lawsuit built on an unverified survey and years of documented informal permission. She further ordered the association to formally correct its community records to reflect accurate property boundaries, removing any references suggesting shared or disputed ownership of the road. The courtroom fell into a heavy silence as the ruling concluded, broken only by the quiet shuffle of papers as Renee Alvarez calmly gathered the documents that had, in the end, decided everything. Victoria Sterling sat motionless at the plaintiff's table, her earlier confidence entirely drained from her face, while Ethan simply rose, nodded once toward the judge, and walked out of the courtroom without a word to the reporters waiting outside. 1 week after the ruling, Ethan Carter sent a formal written notice to the Homeowners Association, informing them that the years of free, informal access across his land had officially come to an end. He explained plainly that since the association had chosen litigation over gratitude, he saw no further reason to extend a courtesy that had never been legally required of him in the first place. Within days, a construction crew hired by Ethan arrived at the base of the access road and began installing a heavy steel gate anchored deep into the ground on either side. Security cameras followed shortly after, mounted on tall poles overlooking the entrance, alongside a simple metal sign that read, "Private property, no public access, no exceptions." The first morning the gate remained locked. A long line of vehicles backed up along the narrow mountain road leading toward Ridgeview Summit, drivers honking in confusion as they realized there was no way through. Delivery trucks idled uselessly at the base of the hill, unable to reach the homes waiting for packages further up the mountain, while residents trying to leave for work found themselves trapped just as thoroughly as those trying to return. Victoria Sterling arrived at the gate herself within the hour, standing before the locked steel barrier, with an expression of stunned disbelief that no amount of authority or confidence could soften. She pressed the intercom button mounted beside the gate repeatedly, but no one answered, because Ethan Carter had made it clear in his written notice that verbal negotiations were no longer part of the arrangement. Within the community itself, the closure created chaos far beyond simple inconvenience, as residents quickly discovered how completely their daily lives had depended on a road they had always assumed belonged to them. Grocery delivery services suspended routes entirely, informing customers that the private gate blocked their standard access paths and offering no alternative solution. Home health aides caring for elderly residents were unable to reach their patients, forcing several families to scramble for emergency arrangements outside the community. Even emergency response vehicles faced unexpected delays, since dispatchers had never been informed of any alternate route into Ridgeview Summit, having relied for years on the same road now closed behind a locked gate. As the closure stretched from days into weeks, the financial consequences for Ridgeview Summit residents became impossible to ignore, with several homeowners reporting that real estate agents had begun advising against new listings until the access issue resolved. Contractors working on ongoing renovation projects packed up their equipment and left, unwilling to navigate the confusion surrounding the blocked entrance, leaving half-finished additions and driveways scattered throughout the neighborhood. Property values, once a point of pride among residents, began sliding as prospective buyers heard about the situation and quietly withdrew their interest. Board meetings that had once run smoothly under Victoria's confident leadership devolved into shouting matches, residents demanding answers she increasingly struggled to provide. A resident named Sarah Donnelly, whose elderly mother lived with her and required regular visits from a home health aide, stood up at one particularly tense gathering and described in detail how the locked gate had left her mother without proper care for nearly a full week. Her voice cracked as she explained that the aides agency had simply refused to continue the contract once the access road became unreliable, leaving Sarah to manage caregiving duties alone on top of her full-time job. Other residents shared similar stories, a young father whose newborn needed a pediatric visit delayed twice, a small business owner whose home office deliveries had stopped arriving altogether. Each account added weight to a growing sense among residents that the lawsuit Victoria had championed so confidently had cost them far more than legal fees, and that the price had ultimately been paid in the ordinary rhythms of daily life she had never seemed to consider. During one particularly heated emergency meeting, a group of homeowners presented financial records they had obtained through a formal request, revealing the full scope of Victoria's unilateral decision-making throughout the lawsuit. The documents showed that she had personally approved every rejection of settlement discussions, overriding board members who had quietly favored a negotiated resolution with Ethan long before the case ever reached trial. They also revealed that legal fees alone had consumed nearly the entirety of the association's reserve fund, leaving Ridgeview Summit with almost nothing set aside for the road repairs and infrastructure work the community actually needed. Faced with mounting evidence of her mismanagement, a majority of residents at the meeting formally called for her immediate resignation as association president. Victoria attempted to defend her actions for several minutes, insisting that she had only ever acted in the community's best interest, and that the lawsuit had seemed like the responsible path forward at the time. Her words fell flat against a room full of homeowners who had personally experienced weeks of blocked deliveries, stalled renovations, and declining property values as a direct result of her decisions. Realizing that no amount of explanation would restore the trust she had lost, Victoria eventually stopped speaking altogether, sitting silently as the meeting moved forward without her input. By the time residents left that evening, it had become clear to nearly everyone present that continuing to fight Ethan Carter was no longer a viable path for their community. 2 days later, Victoria Sterling drove alone up the narrow road toward Ethan's cedar house, parking well short of the locked gate and walking the remaining distance on foot. She found him repairing a section of fence near the tree line, exactly where he had been standing the day their conflict first began months earlier, though the season had shifted from early autumn into the first cold edges of winter. For a long moment she simply stood there, the confident posture she had carried throughout their entire dispute entirely absent from her frame. When she finally spoke, her voice carried none of the sharpness it once had, replaced instead by something quieter and far more uncertain. "I came to apologize," she said, and the words seemed to cost her more effort than any argument she had ever made in a courtroom. Ethan set down his tools and studied her for a moment before responding, neither triumphant nor unkind in his expression. He had spent months absorbing threats, public criticism, and an aggressive lawsuit without once raising his voice in anger, and he saw no reason to abandon that composure now that circumstances had reversed. He listened as she admitted, haltingly, that she had let pride and certainty guide decisions that should have been shaped by patience and honest history instead. She acknowledged, for the first time since the dispute began, that the free access he had extended for years had never been an obligation, but a kindness she had failed to recognize until it was taken away entirely. Ethan did not respond immediately, choosing instead to consider what she had said with the same careful deliberation he brought to every decision throughout the entire ordeal. He had no interest in prolonging anyone's suffering simply because the law had ultimately sided with him, nor did he feel any particular satisfaction in watching an entire community struggle over a conflict that had never needed to happen in the first place. Rather than offer forgiveness or condemnation, he suggested they sit down together and discuss what a fair path forward might actually look like for everyone involved. Victoria agreed immediately, relieved that he was willing to speak with her at all after everything the association had put him through. Over the following days, Ethan worked alongside Renee Alvarez to draft a formal proposal that would restore access to Ridgeview Summit under terms far different from the arrangement that had existed before the lawsuit. The agreement specified that the Homeowners Association would pay an annual usage fee for continued access across his land, replacing the years of free passage that had ultimately been mistaken for entitlement. It further stipulated that the association could never again pursue litigation against him without documented cause, and that any future disputes would first require mediation before either party could return to court. Additional terms placed full responsibility for road maintenance and repair costs onto the association, ensuring that Ethan would never again bear the burden of a resource he did not exclusively use. Renee presented the proposal to the full board and residency of Ridgeview Summit during a specially called meeting, walking through each provision in careful detail while residents listened in a silence far different from the confident chatter that had once filled their meetings. Several homeowners asked pointed questions about the annual fee structure, wanting reassurance that the amount remained reasonable given the years of free access they had previously enjoyed. Renee explained patiently that the fee represented fair compensation for continued private road use, calculated to cover reasonable wear without placing undue burden on the community's finances. After a period of discussion that stretched well into the evening, the residents called for a formal vote on whether to accept the terms Ethan had proposed. The vote passed by an overwhelming margin, with nearly every homeowner present recognizing that the agreement offered a far better path forward than continued conflict with a landowner who held every legal advantage. As part of the same meeting, residents also voted to remove Victoria Sterling from her position as association president, citing both her handling of the lawsuit and the financial mismanagement that had nearly bankrupted their reserve fund. In her place, the community elected a new interim board led by residents who had quietly favored negotiation from the very beginning of the dispute, including the retired accountant who had first uncovered the extent of the unauthorized spending and the older couple who had questioned Victoria's narrative long before the trial ever began. Walter Higgins, in particular, found himself unexpectedly cast into a leadership role he had never sought, agreeing to chair the finance committee only after several neighbors insisted that his careful attention to detail was exactly what the community needed after months of unchecked decisions. Under the new board's guidance, meetings returned to a calmer rhythm, decisions were documented transparently, and residents were encouraged to raise concerns openly rather than defer automatically to whoever spoke with the most confidence in the room. Victoria accepted the removal without protest, acknowledging to those still willing to listen that she had lost the trust of her neighbors through decisions she now recognized as driven more by pride than wisdom. With the agreement finalized and signed by both parties, Ethan personally opened the steel gate that had blocked Ridgeview Summit's only entrance for nearly a month. Watching as the first line of vehicles finally rolled through toward homes, many residents had been unable to properly reach for weeks. Delivery trucks resumed their routes within days, contractors returned to finish stalled renovation projects, and the steady rhythm of daily life slowly returned to the mountain community. Residents who passed Ethan's cedar house on their way in and out often gave a small wave or nod, a quiet acknowledgement of the conflict that had reshaped their understanding of exactly what they owed to the man whose land they depended on. Ethan returned each gesture simply, without ceremony, continuing his mornings of fence repair and quiet solitude much as he always had. In the months that followed, the new board leadership worked diligently to rebuild the trust that Victoria's leadership had eroded, hosting regular meetings where financial decisions were reviewed openly rather than approved behind closed doors. The annual road fee, paid without complaint, funded not only Ethan's fair compensation but also long overdue repairs to sections of the access road that had been neglected for years, including a stretch near the lower switchback that had washed out slightly during heavy spring rains for as long as anyone could remember. Contractors hired under the new agreement completed the repairs within a single season, working alongside Ethan rather than around him, often stopping by his cedar house afterward to update him on their progress as a simple courtesy. Sarah Donnelly's mother regained consistent access to her home health aide within weeks of the gate reopening, and Sarah herself became one of the more vocal advocates for maintaining a respectful, transparent relationship between the community and the man whose land they depended upon. Community sentiment shifted gradually from resentment toward quiet respect, as residents came to understand the difference between a neighbor's generosity and a legal entitlement they had never actually possessed. Even those who had once shared unflattering photographs of Ethan's property online quietly deleted the old posts, embarrassed by how quickly they had judged a man who had asked for nothing beyond fairness and honesty. The older couple who had first questioned Victoria's version of events during that early community gathering eventually stopped by Ethan's cedar house one Sunday afternoon, bringing a jar of homemade preserves as a small gesture of goodwill. They admitted they had felt uneasy about the lawsuit from its earliest days, sensing that something in Victoria's certainty did not match what they remembered of the community's history, though they had lacked the standing to challenge her publicly at the time. Ethan accepted the preserves graciously, telling them there was no debt between neighbors that required repayment, only an understanding that ought to have existed from the beginning. It was a small moment, unremarkable to anyone passing by on the road below, but it captured something essential about how the entire ordeal finally came to rest. As winter settled fully over the mountain, Ethan stood one evening near the ridge above his property, watching the last amber light of sunset stretch across the reopened road below. Vehicles moved steadily along it now, their headlights cutting soft paths through the gathering dusk as residents returned home from work and errands, the rhythm of ordinary life restored to a community that had nearly torn itself apart. He thought back over the months of letters, threats, and courtroom arguments, recognizing that none of it had ever truly been necessary, and none of it had changed who he was or what he owned. The land his family had held for more than a century remained entirely his, its boundaries now more clearly documented than ever before, protected not by anger but by patience and careful preparation. Somewhere below, lights flickered on in the windows of Ridgeview Summit, ordinary families settling into ordinary evenings, unaware, or perhaps only now, beginning to understand how close they had come to losing something they had always taken for granted. A dog barked faintly near one of the driveways, and the distant sound of laughter drifted up from a porch where neighbors had gathered to share a late dinner together, the kind of small, unremarkable moment that could only exist because a road remained open. Ethan turned from the ridge and walked back toward his cedar house, the cold air sharp against his face, his boots crunching softly over the first thin layer of frost settling across the ground. He thought, too, of his grandfather's handwritten letter, the one Renee had entered so carefully into the court record, and of how strange it felt that a man long gone could still speak clearly enough to settle a dispute his descendants never expected to face. Kindness, Ethan had come to understand more clearly than ever, was never an obligation owed to anyone, no matter how long it had been extended or how comfortable others became with receiving it. When that kindness was met instead with greed and overreach, the quiet strength of patience, documented truth, and the law itself could answer far more powerfully than anger ever could. And in the end, that answer had been enough.